Ethan Sullivan never considered himself easily shaken. As a Harvard senior, he had spent countless nights in the towering halls of Widener Library, lost in the depths of historical research. But tonight felt different. The library, usually a haven of hushed whispers and the rhythmic turning of pages, felt eerily empty. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly overhead, casting elongated shadows that stretched unnaturally along the bookshelves. The rain outside tapped against the massive windows, adding to the oppressive silence. Ethan checked his watch. 11:45 p.m. He had stayed later than usual, but finals were approaching, and he needed every second to prepare. As he packed his notes into his bag, the university's intercom crackled to life, making him jump. The robotic voice echoed across the vast, deserted library. "Attention students and faculty. This is a campus-wide lockdown. Follow emergency procedures immediately. This is not a drill." The word sent a cold shiver down Ethan's spine. Lockdowns weren't uncommon in schools, but something about the urgency in the voice made his pulse quicken. His phone buzzed. A message from Olivia. "Ethan, something's wrong. I saw someone in the dorms. He had a mask." A mask? Ethan's breath hitched. He glanced around the empty library. The librarian at the front desk stood frozen, eyes wide in fear. He wasn't alone. There were still a handful of students scattered throughout the aisles, all of them now standing stiff with unease. The doors to the library were already being locked. Then, from somewhere in the vast stacks of books behind him, he heard it. A soft shuffle. Slow, deliberate. Someone else was inside the library, and they weren't supposed to be there. Ethan's breath hitched as the soft shuffle echoed through the aisles of towering bookshelves. His fingers clenched around the strap of his bag, knuckles turning white. The dim glow of the library lights flickered again, as if sensing the tension thickening in the air. He turned slowly, scanning the long, narrow corridor of books, but the shadows stretched deep, swallowing anything beyond the first few shelves. His phone buzzed again. He fumbled to unlock it. Another message from Olivia. "He's on the second floor. I don't think he's alone. Get somewhere safe. Now." Ethan swallowed hard. The second floor. That was just above him. He glanced toward the grand staircase leading up to the next level, his stomach twisting at the thought of someone watching from the balcony above. The wooden floors groaned, but this time it wasn't him who made the sound. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. A heavy thud. A book fell off a shelf to his left, hitting the floor with a hollow echo. Someone, or something, was moving between the aisles. Ethan forced himself to stay still, barely daring to breathe. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but he didn't know where was safe. The front doors were already locked, and he wasn't sure if the librarian had the key. A glance at the front desk showed her frantically typing on her computer, her face pale with fear. Another footstep. Closer. Then, a voice. Low, deliberate. "You should have left earlier." Ethan spun around, but saw nothing. Only rows and rows of books, the flickering light casting eerie shadows that seemed to stretch and move. His pulse pounded in his throat. The voice had come from somewhere behind him, but the echoes made it impossible to tell exactly where. He backed up, nearly knocking over a chair, and pressed himself against the nearest bookshelf, trying to stay hidden. He peeked through the gaps between books, straining to see movement. A dark figure loomed near the stairwell. Tall, dressed in black, the outline of a mask just barely visible under the flickering lights. Then, the figure took a step forward. Ethan clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay silent. The masked figure tilted its head slightly, as if listening, searching. Ethan fought to control his breathing, but the adrenaline flooding his system made it nearly impossible to keep quiet. His phone vibrated again, loud in the deafening silence. He barely managed to stifle a gasp. The masked figure snapped its head in his direction. Then it moved, fast. Ethan ran. He bolted down the narrow aisle, his sneakers squeaking against the polished wooden floor. The sound of rushing footsteps followed behind him, closing the distance. He turned a sharp corner, knocking into a bookshelf, sending books tumbling to the floor. He didn't stop. His lungs burned as he darted toward the emergency exit at the far end of the library. But when he reached the door, his last hope, it wouldn't budge. The emergency exit had been chained shut, and behind him, the masked figure was still coming. Ethan's hands trembled as he yanked at the heavy chains barring the emergency exit. The rusted metal links rattled violently, the sound bouncing off the library's high ceilings, but they didn't budge. His breathing was ragged, his pulse hammering against his ribs. He could hear footsteps growing louder, the masked figure closing in. Too fast, too close. With nowhere left to go, he threw himself behind a nearby bookshelf, heart pounding so hard it felt like it would shatter his ribs. His fingers dug into the polished wood, steadying himself as he crouched low, pressing his back against the cold wall. He couldn't see the masked figure anymore, but that only made it worse. The library had fallen into unnatural silence. No more footsteps, no rustling of clothes, nothing. Ethan clenched his jaw to keep his breathing quiet, his eyes darting between the shelves. Where had he gone? A shuffling sound. He stiffened. It came from the next aisle over, just a few feet away. Ethan forced himself to move, crawling along the bottom shelf, careful not to knock over any books. He reached the end of the row and peeked around the corner. Empty. The masked figure was gone. But how? A cold whisper of air brushed against the back of his neck. Ethan's blood turned to ice. He spun around, but there was no one there, just the rows of ancient bookshelves standing like silent sentinels, towering over him. His mind raced, his body screamed at him to run, but where? The front doors were locked, the emergency exit was chained, the librarian had vanished. Then his phone vibrated again. Ethan fumbled for it, his sweaty fingers barely able to unlock the screen. Olivia, there's another way out. Basement. Look for the old librarian's office. Move. The basement. Ethan barely knew what was down there. He had never seen anyone use it, but he had no choice. He bolted toward the back of the library, skidding as he turned a sharp corner. His sneakers squeaked against the marble floor, the sound slicing through the stillness like a knife. He forced himself to focus. If the masked figure was still nearby, he wasn't going to give him another chance to trap him. He reached the door labeled staff only, heart hammering. He pushed, locked. Panic surged. No, no, no! His eyes darted to the counter. The librarian had left her desk in a hurry. Maybe... The keys? Ethan sprinted toward the desk, searching. The drawers were locked, but a ring of keys lay abandoned on the surface. He snatched them up, just as a shadow moved across the wall. Ethan turned, his breath catching. The masked figure stood at the end of the aisle, motionless, watching. Ethan didn't think. He ran. He reached the staff door, jammed a key into the lock, twisted. Click. The door swung open. Ethan threw himself inside and slammed it shut, just as something heavy crashed against it. The handle jerked violently. Ethan backed away, heart pounding. The masked figure was trying to get in. Then, silence. Ethan staggered backward, his eyes scanning the dim stairwell leading down into darkness. He swallowed. There was no turning back now. He descended into the unknown. The air in the stairwell was thick with dust, each step kicking up motes that swirled like ghosts in the dim glow of Ethan's phone flashlight. His breathing was uneven, ragged, the weight of fear pressing down on his chest. The door above him hadn't moved since he slammed it shut, but he knew better than to assume the masked figure had given up. He wasn't alone down here. The steps groaned beneath his weight, their old wood warped with time. The air grew colder the further he descended, the musty scent of aged paper giving way to something heavier. Earthy, damp, and tinged with something metallic. Ethan reached the bottom of the stairs and hesitated. Before him stretched a long, arched hallway, the walls lined with bookshelves that seemed older than Harvard itself. Unlike the ones above, these books were bound in thick leather, their spines cracked with age, some of them missing titles entirely. It felt as though they weren't meant to be read, meant to be forgotten. A soft creak echoed from somewhere ahead. Ethan's grip tightened around his phone. He swung the light toward the noise, illuminating a massive iron-wrought door at the end of the corridor. It was slightly ajar, its heavy hinges protesting as if disturbed after years of undisturbed silence. Beyond it lay darkness. A message buzzed on his phone screen. Olivia, You need to find the ledger. It has the names, the ones who disappeared. Ethan swallowed hard. Disappeared? He turned back to the shelves, his fingers grazing the cracked bindings. Some of these books weren't labeled, only marked with symbols etched into the leather, foreign and ominous. His flashlight flickered, sending long shadows dancing across the walls. A sound. A low, muffled whisper. Ethan froze. The whisper wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from the books. He took a slow step back. The sensation of being watched crawled over his skin, a prickling, unrelenting presence slithering between the shelves. His eyes darted around. Nothing. But something felt wrong. Then, footsteps. Not his own. From behind the iron door. Ethan turned, his stomach twisting. His mind screamed, "Run," but Olivia's message pulsed on his screen. If he left now, he might never get another chance. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open further. A rush of cold air spilled out from the room beyond, carrying the scent of damp stone and something faintly rotting. His flashlight wavered, struggling against the oppressive dark. Inside, a massive wooden desk sat in the center of the chamber, its surface covered in old documents, some stained, some torn. Behind it, the walls were lined with portraits, but these weren't ordinary paintings. The eyes of the figures in them were hollow, scratched out, erased. And then he saw it, an open book lying in the center of the desk. The ledger. Ethan stepped forward, hand trembling as he flipped the brittle pages. The names were handwritten, neat and precise, until they weren't. The last few entries were scrawled in jagged ink, the lines erratic, as if written by a trembling hand. And at the bottom of the list, his name. Ethan stumbled back. The whispering grew louder, swirling around him, words he couldn't understand but could feel, calling, demanding. Then, the door slammed shut behind him. The echoing slam of the door sent a shockwave of fear through Ethan's chest. He spun around, his breath hitching. But the door was now sealed shut, its iron frame impossibly heavy, as if it had never been meant to open again. The flickering glow from his flashlight cast warped shadows against the damp stone walls, distorting the eerie paintings that watched him with hollowed-out eyes. The whispering had not stopped. If anything, it had grown stronger, a chorus of voices bleeding from the very fabric of the room. Ethan turned back to the ledger. His name stared back at him, ink wet and glistening as if it had just been written. He swallowed hard, his mind spiraling with questions. Who had written it? And worse, what happened to the others on the list? A gust of cold air curled around him, carrying the scent of decay and something ancient, something watching. His fingers trembled as he turned the brittle pages, scanning the names. Some had been crossed out, the ink violently scratched over them. Others simply ended mid-sentence, as if the writer had been interrupted. The last full entry before his name was from nearly a century ago. Then, the whispers turned to laughter. A deep, rasping chuckle, layered with something inhuman, vibrated through the chamber. Ethan staggered back, his flashlight flickering uncontrollably, casting the room into momentary darkness. When the light returned, the portraits had changed. The figures, they had faces now. Their eyes were filled in, dark and piercing, their expressions twisted into grim, knowing smiles. Ethan's stomach plummeted. He knew, without a doubt, that he was not alone. The whispering grew into a chant, rising and falling in a rhythmic hum, each word slithering into his ears like serpents. He stepped away from the desk, heart hammering, but something shifted beneath his feet. The floor was warping, buckling, as if something beneath it was stirring. Then, a shadow peeled away from the wall, slithering toward him with an unnatural grace. Its form was shapeless, yet watchful, its presence sending an icy dread through Ethan's spine. He stumbled back, crashing into the desk, the ledger flipping open again on its own. The ink on the page began to shift, the letters twisting, bleeding together, forming something new. His name, once solid and still, was now dripping, sinking into the paper as if being erased. The whispers turned into screams. Ethan grabbed the book in a panic, flipping through its pages wildly, searching for anything, a way out, An answer, a clue. But the more he searched, the more the ink bled, forming words that weren't there before. A name written is a soul taken. His breath hitched. A name erased is a soul forgotten. The air around him thickened, the shadows stretching closer, reaching for him with elongated fingers. Panic surged through his veins. If his name was being erased, did that mean... No. He had to stop it. With a surge of desperation, Ethan grabbed the nearest quill, dipped in ancient ink, and scrawled something onto the page. A new name. Any name. The whispers hiccuped. The shadows stalled, as if caught off guard. The ink on the page stilled. The room groaned, as if the very walls had been holding their breath. Then, in an instant, the door behind him flew open, slamming against the stone. A gust of cold wind howled through the chamber, extinguishing his light. Ethan didn't hesitate. He ran. Ethan's feet pounded against the stone floor as he sprinted toward the open door, lungs burning, heart hammering against his ribs. The whispers didn't fade. They grew louder, more frantic, as if they sensed his defiance. The ledger, still clutched tightly in his hands, felt heavier than before, its pages thrumming with an unnatural energy. He didn't dare look back. He didn't need to. He could feel them chasing him. The corridor ahead was impossibly long, stretching into the darkness, twisting like a living thing. His flashlight flickered again, its dim glow barely keeping the shadows at bay. The air around him thickened, suffocating, and with every breath, he felt as though he were inhaling whispers and memories that weren't his own. A sudden gust of icy wind slammed into him, nearly knocking him off balance. The walls around him shuddered, the stone cracking as if the entire foundation of the university was shifting beneath unseen hands. He stumbled, barely catching himself before hitting the ground. A scream, his own or someone else's, echoed through the halls. He had to keep going. With a final burst of energy, Ethan threw himself forward, bursting through an archway at the end of the hall. He staggered into a massive, circular chamber, its ceiling lost in shadows, its walls lined with towering bookshelves filled with volumes too ancient to exist in the modern world. At the center stood a massive, ornate mirror. Tall as the ceiling, its silver frame intricately carved with symbols that pulsed faintly in the dark. The surface of the mirror was not glass, but a swirling, liquid darkness that shifted and moved like a storm trapped beneath the surface. Ethan skidded to a stop, breath coming in ragged gasps. He had never seen this room before, hadn't even known it existed, but he knew with a sickening certainty that this mirror was not meant to be here. Behind him, the whispers converged into a deafening wail. The shadows spilled into the room like a tide, crawling along the floor, slithering up the walls. The watchers had come. A shape peeled away from the darkness, forming into the familiar silhouette of the figure he had glimpsed in the paintings. The faceless thing, its presence suffocating, raised one long, withered hand toward him. It was pointing at the mirror. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to run, to fight. But something in his mind, a voice that was not his own, whispered a single command. Look. Despite everything, he turned his gaze to the mirror. At first, he saw only himself, wide-eyed, disheveled, terrified. Then, slowly, his reflection changed. The Ethan in the mirror was not him. The face staring back was worn, aged, eyes hollow and filled with knowledge of things no human should ever bear. And then, the reflection smiled. Not a reassuring smile, not relief. A mocking grin. Ethan's stomach plummeted as he realized what it meant. He wasn't escaping. He was switching places. The reflection lifted its hand, mirroring Ethan's trembling movements. A single word formed on its lips. A silent, final declaration. Welcome. The mirror rippled, and before Ethan could move, the shadows surged forward, shoving him into the abyss. Ethan's breath came in short, panicked gasps as the figures stepped closer. Their blurred faces seemed to shift, like smoke trapped behind glass, their outlines flickering as though they weren't fully formed. Yet their eyes, or the dark voids where eyes should have been, remained fixed on him. Their movements slow, deliberate, He backed away, his pulse hammering in his ears. The stone beneath his feet felt wrong, as if it wasn't real, just an echo of the world he had left behind. He was trapped in a reflection, but this place was more than just a mirror. It was a prison. A voice whispered, soft as the turning of a page, "Another one joins the forgotten." Ethan whirled around, his back colliding with a towering bookshelf. The figures halted, standing in a semicircle around him, their forms unnatural, jagged, like broken marionettes suspended on invisible strings. "This isn't real," Ethan whispered, his fingers clenching into fists. "It can't be real." One of the figures tilted its head, the sound of grinding glass accompanying the movement. Then, slowly, it lifted an arm and pointed. Ethan followed its gesture. At the far end of the vast, shadowed library, a single book lay open on a pedestal. A cold wave of dread washed over him. The book called to him, though not with words. Something deeper, more primal, like a whispered secret just on the edge of hearing. He could feel it in his bones, in his mind. A part of him already knew what it was. "Read and be written." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere. Ethan forced himself to move, each step toward the book feeling like walking against an invisible current. The figures did not follow, they only watched. When he reached the pedestal, he hesitated. The book was ancient, its pages a faded yellow, the ink almost bleeding into the parchment. His name was already there, scrawled at the top of the page. His hands trembled as he read the words beneath it. Ethan Reynolds enters the Library of the Lost, forever bound to the reflection. His story unwritten, waiting to be completed. His stomach dropped. The book was writing itself. A sharp, inhuman hiss filled the air. Ethan snapped his head up just as the figures moved for the first time. No longer slow, no longer hesitant. They rushed forward, their arms outstretched, their whispers turning into a deafening chorus. Panic surged through Ethan. He had to stop this. He grabbed the book, his fingers pressing against the ancient pages. If this place was writing him into its story, maybe, just maybe, he could rewrite it. His heart pounded as he gripped the ink-stained quill resting beside the book. With trembling hands, he scrawled new words beneath the cursed passage. Ethan Reynolds refuses the reflection. He leaves the Library of the Lost. The book shuddered. The whispers turned to screams. The figures reeled back, their forms flickering, shattering like glass. The entire library quaked, bookshelves collapsing, the walls cracking. The world itself was coming undone. And then, the mirror shattered. The sound of shattering glass filled Ethan's ears, but it wasn't just one mirror. It was all of them. Every surface in the library fractured at once, sending jagged shards cascading through the air. The figures around him writhed, their forms flickering violently, as if their very existence was unraveling. Their whispers became a howling wind, an agonized wail that echoed through the collapsing void. Ethan barely had time to react before the floor beneath him splintered apart. He felt himself falling, weightless, tumbling through the darkness as fragments of books, shelves, and shadows spun around him. His stomach churned as the world twisted inside out, the ink from the book dripping off the pages, spiraling in the air like black tendrils reaching for him. And then, silence. Ethan hit solid ground with a jarring impact, his body aching from the fall. He gasped, sucking in deep lungfuls of air, and realized that the heavy stillness of the library was gone. No whispers, no figures, no suffocating darkness. Blinking, he pushed himself up and looked around. He was in the library of Harvard University, the real one, dusty, dimly lit, and entirely normal. His shaking hands pressed against the cool wooden floor as he tried to ground himself. Had it really happened, or had he been lost in some waking nightmare? But then, his blood ran cold. In front of him, resting on the floor where the pedestal had been, was the same book. And this time, the page was blank, except for one chilling line, freshly written. The reflection watches.
If you are interested in the dark details of this story, please leave a comment with your thoughts. Click the like button to support, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see more scary stories.